Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to yet another episode of The Canadian Story. Thank you so much to everyone who keeps tuning in and dropping in and listening to us just work through what's going on in our country. So today is a super fun episode. I'm really looking forward to it because we are joined, of course, by Mr. David Parker, who many of you probably know as my cousin, but we have also brought on two more of my cousins, Mr. Luke Mason and Mr. Daniel Leythem. And what we're going to do today, we are, 2.5 years into this whole pandemic business. We are just going to take time as a group of cousins to just discuss and kind of reflect on what this experience has meant and been for each of us. And we hope that through this conversation, we get to hear a couple different perspectives and a couple different ways of looking at what our country has gone through. So I suppose I'll start. For me, like anyone else, so my background is in the music industry. I was touring quite heavily with a band called Walk Off the Earth at the time of the pandemic. So things shut down in March. In January, I was touring in Australia. In February, I was touring in the United States. And when I got the call from my tour manager that all of the tour dates were canceled for the rest of the year, we had shows booked up into October. So the first thing that happened was I was like, ooh, that's a lot of money I'm not going to make, which was nerve-wracking. And thankfully, I was able to pivot and do some other work. But at the front end, I think like anyone else, when we first locked down here in Ontario, I was like, yeah, that's probably a pretty good idea. Like if we can kind of crush this in 2 weeks by just staying home, hey, call it what it is. I'll take a 2-week vacation. I'll stay home. And then we can just go back to life. And as we all know and understand, that's not how things shook down for any of us anywhere in the world, basically. But I started becoming, me personally, suspicious around the same time that Roman Baber published his public letter to Doug Ford and was fired subsequently for that letter from the Conservative caucus. It was the first time that I saw actual numbers on the pandemic. And thus far, what we had been told was everyone's dying, millions dead. Like it's coming. We're all screwed. And then Mr. Baber published this letter, and looking at my age demographic, the case fatality rate was significantly lower than 1%. And the sliding scale, obviously, as we all understand now, moved toward the older population. And obviously, no one wants to see loss of life. No one desires that. We're not idiots. But it was the first opportunity to it was the first piece of real pandemic data I got my hands on. And it painted a very different picture than what I felt like I was being told in the news.
I just got to that too, is that like it was pretty clear pretty early on as well that they were like, at least anecdotally anyways, they were like manufacturing numbers in the sense that like, anybody who had COVID and passed away was written down as a COVID death, and they're just like, inflating the numbers in that sense. And it's like, if you had literally, there was a case in Alberta where a kid had stage 4 terminal brain cancer, caught COVID and passed away, and they wrote him down as a COVID death. And the family had to go to the province and be like, yo,
he did not die of COVID. Yeah,
right.
Exactly. So that's what happened. So I, at the point of Mr. Baber's letter, I had to don my tin hat and start looking into all of those sorts of things because they didn't start out as public knowledge. The idea that they were inflating numbers was widely spread, but in unconfirmed sources. And then it took maybe a year and a half for them to come out and say, yeah, we weren't really differentiating between deaths from COVID and deaths with COVID. And turns out only about 50% of the deaths that we've registered were directly from COVID, and about 50% were death with COVID. And so it turned into a huge mess of, is this true? Is this not true? What is actually going on? And trying to figure out the mess. And so I guess at this point, I'll turn it over to Mr. Dan Leythem, since he's already made an appearance. What was it like for you?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of similarities to you, but I would also add that, like, those numbers, which was why I was sort of, had my backup early on, was that, like, those numbers that were like, being inflated were being used, to just like hammer home this fear mongering, approach to, get everybody to just panic and hide, you know what I mean? And I was like, we'll take care of it. And it's like, well, you didn't take care of it, and it's like, you're not, like, if there's, something that's that contagious, you're not going to contain it, you know what I mean? And it's like, what I said like Zach, I was, feeling like, 2 weeks, sure, that's cool. Like that kind of makes sense. We'll just, sort of try to squash it and, move on. But after that 2 weeks, I was pretty much right away. I was like, anybody who's like scared, absolutely. There's like, the reasons to be cautious about COVID and stuff like that. And, for some people it can be a real problem, but, I was, from day one, pretty much, I was like, we're gonna ruin the world, doing this for too long. And, I was like, the young and healthy should go out, work, carry on. This is our, burden to bear, if you will. And, we'll shoulder the weight of keeping the economy moving. I'll go out, I'll risk getting COVID. It's not a big deal, and we'll just sort of continue on. But people just lost their minds, and it was like, you're not allowed to do anything. It's like, if you're not, shutting yourself in your home, you're evil and you're bringing us all down. And then that whole mentality, and it was like, we're never going to go back to that previous world where, people, just live their lives, and, it was just like a live and let live kind of, approach to life for the most part, but it's interesting. Like, it's like a slippery slope. I've heard so many people with the vaccine stuff. It's like, well, seat belts are mandated, which I don't agree with, but it's like, this is what has happened in Canada. I feel is that, like, we've gone down sort of this like bit of like a slippery slope where it's like, well, we're okay with just, passing off this little freedom. It's like, I don't, seatbelt laws are kind of a tangent, but it's like, really, there's no reason in a free society where the government should tell me that I have to, do something for my own protection. There's good ideas. Wearing a seatbelt's a wonderful idea. It's a great idea. But I disagree with the government being able to like come in and like tell me, hey, like, you have to do this or that doesn't have any impact on anybody else, which, as we've seen with the COVID vaccines, like, it doesn't reduce transmission. For whatever reason in Canada, the government is still imposing these travel restrictions and stuff like that. I mean, none of it really made any sense from day one, and it continues to not make sense. But I feel like world leaders got themselves into a pickle because they tried to get out front of it, and they tried to they didn't want to be caught looking like they weren't doing enough. So I think they did too much. And then once they started in on that sort of trajectory of action, they were sort of like, caught having to like uphold appearances where it's like, no, we were, making the correct steps, and, we were correct to take these actions, and, justifying their past behavior so that they didn't look like fools for like ruining the world.
and you're just a fringe minority with unacceptable views, Dan. That's your
well, that's all I am in Canada. Canadians need to ask, should I be tolerated?
You're taking up space, Dan. You're taking up space.
Well, not anymore.
Perfectly clean air.
No, you're not anymore. Talk about
American
that,
air now.
Yeah, Dan, you're not taking up space anymore. Why is that?
I'm taking up space in America. But I decided to move. I've been a dual citizen my whole life. And I honestly never would have crossed my mind, I don't think, to move. I've always been like a proud Canadian. I love the land. I love so many of the people. I love the traditions, like being down here in Texas. Like, I miss like, just like hockey culture, and just like, all the great memories of like going to the rink and stuff like that. And I mean, it's not like I was like, playing hockey actively when I was, living back in Canada, but it's just like, being down in a different culture, different environment and stuff like that, it really makes you miss that kind of stuff. But yeah, I was just like, with all the vaccine mandate stuff and all that, all the hostility that I would get from my fellow citizens for like making a personal medical choice, and like people being they've developed this mentality of like, well, if you don't get vaccinated, you don't care about me, or it's like you're making this problem worse or whatever, which there's no data to support my being unvaccinated being the problem for anybody else. Even protection for yourself, it seems like it's one of the less effective vaccines for reducing hospitalization and death compared to polio, which is like 100%. You know what I mean? In the past, that's been more or less like the benchmark. You know what I mean? It's like you essentially cure it with a vaccine. This is like it's a flu shot basically, but which I mean, I'm not a medical expert, but there's nobody in the past ever called the flu shot really like a vaccine, because it doesn't prevent the flu, just like the COVID vaccine doesn't prevent COVID. Like just with all the mandates and stuff like that, and it was just like, I felt like the walls were like closing in on me in Canada, and it was just like becoming more and more hostile towards the unvaccinated. Zach, I know you had a situation as well where like you weren't allowed to cross the border to go to a wedding not too long ago.
Yeah, I got turned around.
Yeah, and I don't know what difference that makes. I can speak as well when I was doing a prospecting. I was traveling down to Texas and stuff like that to take a look at things and decide if I wanted to come down here. Crossing into the States was a breeze. They were just like, they did ask us, "Are you vaccinated?" We said no. And they were just like, "Okay, well, carry on." And then coming back into Canada, I'm not kidding, it felt like coming back into a communist country. Like we were held at the border for 2 hours. They made us like sit outside. They were like, we had taken these like PCR tests as verification to come back through. I disagreed with it personally, but we were traveling with a bunch of kids, so I didn't want to be a problem or hold it up. But there's no the government does not have the ability to bar Canadian citizens from entering the country. They don't have an ability to fine a law-abiding citizen $5,000 for entering without a medical test.
Well, they have the ability, but they don't have the right, or they shouldn't have the right.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, and legally, I don't believe that they do. But I mean, the last couple of years have been just a constant erosion of rights and freedoms, and it's funny that Justin's father was the one who wrote the charter,
Constitution together. I know.
Luke, I want to hear from you. Where are you at?
Hey, Luke Mason, longtime listener, first time caller. Thanks for having me on the program.
Thanks for coming on, Luke.
All the way from British Columbia. We're Canada too. But seriously, thanks for having me on the show, guys. It's been a lot of fun listening, and especially because as COVID started, I was actually living in the same house as David. So kind of the first half of COVID was shared with David, or like 9 months of it anyway, where a lot of things happened. So probably like the rest of you, those first 2 weeks in March when everything started happening and every day felt like a more surreal apocalypse. I was probably genuinely scared of it, as well as like feeling the surreal nature of a global pandemic that hadn't happened for like a century.
Remember we watched Contagion like the first 3 years?
I had a friend that did that too.
As,
we were all like, whoa!
It's kind of like dark therapy. We watched the movie Contagion just to get a sense of like, I guess, how much worse it could be.
My buddy was on shrooms when he watched it as COVID was starting.
Yeah.
That would be nuts.
And like, especially at the beginning, all the stuff was coming in from like Italy and New York a little after that. And it looked horrible, right? Like it was just so terrifying. So I think like most people, the first 2 weeks, I was like genuinely scared and like asking questions of my work of like what their plan was so that we don't all die here kind of thing. And then like for about a month after that, the month of April, I was still wary. I was quite like I was paying more attention to the news about COVID and like what was going on in Canada. And mixed with all of that, I got transferred because my normal job got shut down for the pandemic response. So I got transferred to a group home for traumatized teens.
And that was a wild time.
If there was one group of people who didn't listen to any COVID protocols, it was teens in a group home. So like I was kind of aware of the fact that I was kind of at a higher risk than other people in the populace, because these teens they just went out whenever they wanted. They fraternized with whoever they wanted. There was no such thing as social distancing with them, that kind of thing. It was at a time when you had to wash your hands all the time. They never did. So I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not like super scared of COVID, but if anyone's going to get it, it's probably going to be me in that time. So like that whole summer, up into the summer, that spring of 2020, I was probably wary of COVID the whole time, even though I think fear dissipated after about 2 weeks. And then almost the entire time after, I've been, as I am now, with my arms crossed, skeptical of basically everything coming my way about it. I don't want to like say that I'm different than the three of you, or I might be a mild dissenter on this, I don't know, but I have always taken COVID super seriously, even though I think the leadership and the management of almost every country has done a horrible job. I do think that COVID itself was something that is very different from a lot of other things that we faced. And part of that is because of the fact that it does seem to more negatively affect the elderly and the obese. And that's like two classes of people that it's super politically incorrect to talk anything negative about, or like, I mean, elderly, it's different. You can't help it. But like obesity, you definitely can't say anything about that from a personal.
People make fun of boomers all the time.
Yeah, that's different.
People make fun of boomers all the time.
That's different. They're not the elderly who are
right.
So I guess I've spent the last 2 years in what is probably a pretty highly populated, though underrepresented in the media camp, of people who take COVID pretty seriously and think that people talking to us about COVID are probably BSing us pretty hard on a lot of the levels. So the most steelman version I think I can say about government and social media and media in general on COVID is that they've really put to test the Platonic idea of the noble lie for all of the things going on. And I would submit, in the modern era, the noble lie is out of fashion and not fit for purpose, because there's just too many avenues to find out. And if you do the hard work of saying, like, instead of saying masks don't do anything, saying masks will help, but please don't overbuy them because we need them for our medical professionals because we weren't ready for this. Like, sure, that's a little egg on your face, dear spokesperson of, public health, but at least you didn't lie to us, right? That kind of thing. And so like those kind of more harder decisions and adult way of dealing with a problem have been, to me, the most conspicuous in their absence. Like, this is kind of how I feel like petty 14-year-olds would run a pandemic.
Yeah.
And that's intolerable for people who are adults, regardless of every vibe I give off, right? And one last point, because I think this is a general thing about this whole thing, is that since this is the first global pandemic in the age of the internet in 100 years, there's been a whole new layer to this that has never really existed in previous pandemics, which is public relations and technocracy and bureaucracies at a level that were unfathomable even in the Spanish flu. And I think it's really exposed, again, the not fit to purpose of bloated middle management as leaders. Like, this is just the most, why are the most pathetic people in charge of things? Like, I just don't I don't get how we have got here. Like, I guess it's just peace and prosperity for 75 years have exposed a soft underbelly of our culture and society. And this ties into a podcast I do with David, Really True Fiction. I recently reread The Plague by Camus, because obviously you want to go back to some of the greatest thinkers in history who've touched on these topics to think about it. And the enduring line, to one of your points, Dan, the enduring line of that novel is that the citizens of Oran, who are in the pandemic of the novel, when all of these things are happening, the only thing left is to remain decent to each other. That's the only thing the citizenry had left. And again, that has been conspicuous in its absence in this time. So, like,
can I ask a question, Luke? Just
sure.
For the sake of the listeners, some of them won't know what the noble lie is, the Socrates idea. So if you could kind of articulate that for people.
Not to be pedantic, but I would actually say it's a Plato idea. Socrates idea. Yes. But the noble lie is the noble lie distilled into modern language. The noble lie comes from the book The Republic, and it's basically the idea that something like the philosopher kings can tell noble lies to the citizenry, things that aren't true but are good for them. So it's like kind of a form of what's that term in medical, like paternalism, I guess, right? Like, we're going to do what's best for you. We're going to take care of you. And we don't necessarily need to tell you the truth because we actually know what's best for you, right? So it's like inherently unequal in its assumptions, which I would submit is one of the biggest problems of humanity ever. It's one of the things that gets in the way of a more democratic and liberal society. But
I think we're stupid.
That's a different thing.
I think we're stupid. I think we're too stupid to make our own decisions.
That would be the negative end. I would say even the more charitable interpretation is that they just think you are interested in other things and this is their job, right? Like, it might not even.
That is pretty charitable.
they might. I've spent a lot of my professional life working with people in middle management and administrations, and they don't even think about you when they're making decisions for you. It's just much more like, here's what I got to do. So I actually think for a lot of people, it's much more just this is part of managing, and I don't even really think about your intelligence level as I do this. This is just my job. Quit getting in the way.
Right. Well, David and I were talking about that too, and we're talking about, like, the broad political spectrum, and it's like, overall, like, excellent people are not drawn to politics. You know what I mean? To perform in politics. No, but I'm saying overall, there are obviously exceptions, but like your average politician is just, someone who just was a more or less mediocre person. They're doing this, for, like in Canada, the salaries for MPs are, relatively lucrative for a middle class person, right? And then also the fact of like the status, the power of like, having, decision making capabilities over other people. And it's not even like to Luke's interpretation as well. It's not necessarily like a hostile, like, we're going to, like, lower it over you, and but it is that sort of ego boost of like, well, we're the deciders,
Yeah. Well, it's this mentality of elitism or technocracy, or this idea that the people don't know what they want, but the experts know what the people should want. It's a very, actually, the funny thing, Roman Baber says this a lot, or Baber, sorry, says this a lot. I don't know why I always mispronounce his name, but he says this a lot. He says, Klaus Schwab was not the first person to say you will own nothing and be happy. Karl Marx was. This is the same story repeating itself in cycles. And the idea is that you can centralize decision-making and create a utopia. That is the socialist / communist / Marxist dream, is that the people in charge will make the decisions because they believe that if you perfect the system, you can perfect the people in the system, because they think humans are just inputs into a system, that we are just pure respondents to our environment. And as respondents to our environment, we are simply reacting to the stimuli that comes to us. I don't believe that is what a human is. Lots of people do, but that's the communist utopian ideal.
I'm sure you've heard the old Soviet joke. The one of the secretaries goes up to the generalissimo of the party and just gives all these reports of, the food's not working out, we're not getting enough of the grain, the trains aren't on time, we're in utopia, but utopia not yet here. And the generalissimo just sighs and says, these people are the worst. Our government deserves a better people. Fire the people and get a new one.
Well, funnily enough,
do you think
the premier of Alberta literally said, when he was fighting over these very issues, he said, I don't like my base, I want a new one. And that base said to him, We don't like our leader. We want a new one. Here we are.
Do you think, honestly, at the bottom of his heart, Klaus Schwab thinks he's a charitable and good man?
I think he thinks he's saving the world.
So
a lot of these people.
I think he thinks he's accruing power. Honestly, I'm cynical on that point. It's like he's not out to save the world.
Well, no, okay. So like, think about the movie Endgame, which at some time Luke and I should have do on really true fiction. But what happened? Like, that is, Hitler was a true believer, for example, right? These people who do these things, they actually believe. I think he was. I really do.
It was extremely convenient for him to be able to manufacture an enemy and an other.
Well, yeah, yes, no, but I think that is the natural biological state of humanity, is to create another, right? It's like we're tribal creatures, right? And we want to define ourselves both by who's in the in group and who's in the out group, right? So I think in the case, but in the case of someone like I can't remember the guy's name from Endgame. That's horrible. What, Luke?
Thanos.
Thanos, right? Thanos. He flicks his fingers. He destroys half of humanity because everything's overpopulated. There's not enough resources, and now he saved the universe, right? And he doesn't care what pain and torment he causes to do that, because he believes in the ideological validity of his position, right? He's ideological. Similarly, a lot of these environmentalists who tell women not to have children anymore and that, we're overpopulated, all this, they're not saying those things just out of like trying to accrue power. They're true believers. They truly believe the planet's going to burn up, and that if we don't deal with the population, which is complete garbage. Elon Musk has been attacking this for a while now, but I don't know whether Klaus Schwab himself is or not. The reason he is propped up is because there's an army of true believers who believe that humanity is a disease on this planet. It's from that Matrix scene, right, where Agent Smith says to Neo, "You're a virus," right? These people believe we are viruses on the planet.
I think on a philosophical level, it's like we have in modern day society a complete like pull on opposite ends, but also a marriage almost of like narcissism and like nihilism at the same time, and it's like people like walk around we've made the self God, and when the self is God, nothing matters except your own proclivities and wants and desires. And there's no amount of like respect that I have to give another human being where, they have, a claim towards things that infringe upon my, right. Yeah. The things that infringe upon my happiness or sense of, comfortability or safety, no matter how that manifests. Right. And that's why you see people that are like, on board with like, demanding that their neighbor get vaccinated. I don't think we've never had that before in history. Like they have like obviously like imposed like vaccine like requirements for schools and stuff like that. But it's like at the end of the day, it's like nobody they may check. I've heard that some parents have to go through like re-education training for like vaccines if they decline to get their children vaccinated before school and stuff like that. But it's like, it's not, unless you're going to a different country, which in that case, I do understand like malaria. I understand that, like, to go to a place where you're at risk there or whatever, but like to go into your own, like, like movie theater, like down the street, that's a completely novel concept.
I would say the problem's even worse than you're saying, David. And it's worse because it's more prosaic. It's less sexy than pointing out ideologues. But I think a lot of the issues that have risen in our social life have been because of what I alluded to before. It was like public relations and a kind of more selfish or maybe even non-engaged populace who are not cool with things like vaccine mandates, but don't say so, right? Or
go along to get along.
Yeah, I think there's actually a lot of non-ideological people. The vast majority are pretty non-ideological and more kind of in the spirit of small L liberalism. That is kind of what the Canada I think all four of us grew up in would associate. In this kind of weird state of you just don't want to be you don't want to be the first up the hill, right? Like if you're the first up the hill, you're dead, even if your cause succeeds. And the kind of solidarity of our society has fractured a lot over the last 30 years. And I think there's been all of these kind of underlying maladies that this one very biological malady has unearthed. One of the very earliest things I said to David in this was this virus, this COVID-19 virus, is just bad enough biologically to be crippling socially. If it was significantly worse, we would have had a lot more social solidarity because people were dying on the streets, or the symptoms were like polio or smallpox. It wouldn't be that hard for people to take medicine, let's say.
But they did convince vast swaths of people that was the case.
Well, okay, I might quibble with you on that. That is why a lot of people got vaccinated. I think it actually is a lot more that earlier thing I said of like, oh, it's just No,
I wasn't necessarily saying in terms of like vaccine status or whatever, but I remember reading this one op-ed from this like 21-year-old waitress in like the Toronto Star, and like they just like tentatively opened restaurants back up with limited seating and stuff like that, and she was writing this article about how she was like risking her life
on the front line of the war zone, war
exactly.
zone,
right? Well, and you know, like it's
she's a healthy person.
A lot of the culture war issues are pretty like benign and overblown. There's a handful that like actually legitimately can rile people up en masse, and you know, abortion is one of them, euthanasia, basically anything with human life that becomes a culture war issue is like actually pretty motivating for people. And COVID is a prime example of something like that, because it is a biologically based culture war issue, and so everyone has skin in the game, so to speak, in a lot of ways that some of these other ones are just like, oh, these Twitter morons are going at it kind of thing.
Right. Well, yeah.
And so like, that's what I'm saying. If it was in this kind of uncanny valley of just bad enough biologically to split people based on their own like psychological risk aversion and social safety nets and like kind of general worldview. If it was significantly worse, there'd be a lot more solidarity. And if it was significantly less bad, no one would have noticed it in the first place, right? Like it just wouldn't have been, it wouldn't have become a partisan issue if it was not as bad biologically as it was, which makes all of this so hard because it hit us at a time where it feels like we're at a very, like almost a nadir of kind of social cohesion in our country, which I applaud Zach and David for trying to be part of the remedy to that with this podcast in the first place, right? And so, I mean, that's, my degree is in sociology. I've taken a lot of social and psychological and philosophy courses and books in my life. And so that's like what I really noticed in all of this era is how many social problems this biological problem unearthed.
Yeah,
that's an interesting. Can you elaborate?
Weapon for social engineering.
Luke, can you elaborate on that a little bit? That's really interesting.
Well, I don't want to go too far off course. I mean, I could pontificate all day on these kind of things, but
maybe that's an opportunity for another episode. But why don't you like Cole's notes a thing?
Yeah.
Or two?
Okay. So we're recording this in June of 2022. So as of April 2022, all vaccine mandates for like bars or movie theaters, those are gone, and mask mandates in BC. So in BC, mask mandates ended in March of this year, and vaccine mandates for public life ended in April, which I was against from the beginning, but that's neither here nor there. So now, every now and again, I go to a bookstore or a bar or a grocery store, and some people are wearing their mask, right? And maybe it's different in different parts of Canada. One of the things I love about living in Nelson is that for the most part, it's not 100%. For the most part, nobody cares, right? Nobody cares if you're wearing a mask when it's not mandated. And nobody wearing a mask gives people who aren't wearing a mask a hard time now, right? Now that government mandates aren't in the mix formally, it's civil society again. And I'm encouraged by the fact that everyone is pretty cool about it. There are some stores in Nelson that have signs up that say we still require masks. Now, that not being a government mandate, that being a market decision by that business, I can choose whether I'm going to put a mask on, whether their products are good enough or what I need enough to go in, right? It's a voluntary form. It's the same as like saying you can't come into our store if you're not wearing a shirt, right? Now, and a store could say if you're not vaccinated, you can't come in. I just think that would be a terrible market. Like the market has ways. The market has ways of dealing with decisions like that, right? And I'm much for that. And so I'm encouraged. Maybe this is the sign of the hopeless optimist in me. I'm encouraged by the fact that when the mandates and the kind of sense of the noble lie has dissipated in my town, people are pretty good at dealing with it interpersonally. That is actually letting us be adults again. And so that, if that strategy in some manner had taken place, I'm going to give like 6 weeks a grace period to 6 to 8 weeks grace period to the government and public health in all of this.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Right. Cause this is brand new. And
100%.
You know, I think it's a template for the next pandemic of like letting this be a little bit more dealt with the citizenry. And I'm not a Pollyanna about the citizenry. Like that's kind of the other side of this coin, is that I don't romanticize rebellion against leadership just because it's rebellion against leadership. I think it's like something in philosophy would say it might be necessary, but not sufficient for making a good society. And I'm getting hope by what I'm seeing in the last couple months in Nelson in the way that people are interacting publicly. And I think that's worth noting and taking a lesson of if you are an aspiring leader in this country.
Yeah, I can echo that from Ontario. I spent 2 days covering drum lessons at Along McQuaid for a friend of mine. And I wasn't wearing a mask. The mandate was over. But a number of students came in wearing masks. And because I was filling in and I wanted to be respectful of the person I was filling in for and respectful of the people who were coming in, some of them were wearing masks. And I would ask them, I was like, would you like me to put one on? And not a single one said, yes, please put one on. They said, no, this is our decision. We're happy doing this. You're all good doing what you're doing. And I think that's indicative of a beautiful country and a beautiful relationship between citizens within a country, because left to the individual choices of the citizens, we are capable of constructing a respectful and kind society. And that's the kind of society that we all want to live in. And it's this, I believe in the citizen more than I believe in the government. It's the top-down authoritarian push, again, allowing a grace period because this is incredibly novel and we didn't understand, but the length that the top-down authority has been held, in my opinion, is unacceptable. And I have hopeless and real faith in the citizen that if allowed to make our own decisions and if we were left to our own devices, we would be able to work out our communities in a beautiful way. And I think your story is an example of that. And I think my story is an example of that. And I think that is a path forward for Canada.
You know, I mean,
go ahead.
No, you go, David.
I was just going to say, I think it's the only path forward. If we actually allow our government to continue this, ludicrous situation in which Zach, Dan, and I cannot get on planes in our own country. And Dan has the advantage of having an American citizenship. That's why he can cross the border. Biden still won't let unvaccinated Canadians into America. And I think a lot of people don't know that. The reason I can't go to America is not actually because of Canada's laws. It's because of America's, which means that I actually cannot escape my own country because America has barred me from going across the border and my own government says I can't board a plane. Right. So I'm a prisoner in my own land.
Well, so David, you could take a boat.
No, I can't. It is illegal.
Yeah, you can't even take a boat.
I can't even get on a boat.
Well,
according to the Canadian
buy
government.
your own boat and go across the
ocean. We're gonna have to look into building a wall soon to keep.
I'm just hoping that Dan will come and kind of reverse Underground Railroad me out of the country, right? If things get bad.
I'll be your Harriet Tubman.
Yes, you are. You're basically Harriet Tubman. No, I think. I don't know.
I might note something here. Again, the philosophy nerd in me is saying what you're describing, Zach, is essentially, in my opinion, the difference between Plato and Socrates. Early Plato's dialogues, which is much more what historians think is actual Socrates thought, Socrates basically boils it down to a hatred of reason betrays a hatred of humanity. Because if you don't think your fellow humans are capable of reason, you don't consider them an equal. You consider them below you and just worthy to be treated like objects because you are superior and they are inferior. And so, but Plato obviously differentiated from that greatly in the Republic, talking about philosopher kings and we, the noble lie, and we decide for you. He almost made that hatred of humanity benign and systematic. And I would submit again that the Socratic spirit is the one that says, you know what, even if I disagree with you, even if every decision you make, I'm going to tell it to you. I'm not going to go ask somebody, some local magistrate with the stick to hit you with that stick because I disagree with you. I'm going to go do it to your face and we're going to hash this out and we're not going to use violence. That's the number one thing. We're not going to use coercion or violence. We're going to speak our minds in the John Stuart Mill idea of free speech, and because we're all fallible. We all don't know what we don't know and it gets wrong. And the only way to hash that out is through conversation with other equal citizens. And that ethos, though not, again, sexy in the news, is I still think alive and well in the hearts of Canadians.
Well, you hit the nail on the head there with the word coercion. And that's what this has all been about, right? It's like, so we have, this like social pressure to some ideas that are not bad ideas, right? Social distancing makes some sense. It's not necessarily a foolproof strategy, but it may mitigate some, spread. Masks, no problem with masks, but they were completely oversold as a methodology to reduce COVID. And based on what happened in the ensuing couple of years, they didn't seem to really work at all in terms of limiting the spread. But then when we got into the vaccine situation, there was an initial push where the people that were like genuinely, nervous for themselves, by that point it had often come out already that, it was, frequently the elderly, the obese that had, significant problems with it. There was another contingent of people that were nervous as well, and they went out and got it. It wasn't enough people. I think at that point we were sitting at about like 40% or something like that. And they had to, I think essentially what happened was that they had assumed that everybody was living in the state of hysteria and fear and panic. And they bought vaccines for, the entire population of the country multiple times over. And I think with the people who are actually scared for themselves, that wasn't enough of a contingent to make that investment worthwhile. So then they had to pressure the young and the healthy and the vibrant by taking away their little a little carrot on a stick. It's like, well, we're gonna take away movies and traveling until you do as we say.
Well, it did, Dan, if you remember, it didn't even start there. Do you remember the days of, if you come get your vaccine, we'll give you an ice cream cone? That happened first. How absolutely ridiculous is that?
In Alberta, Jason Kenney said, we'll give you $100.
Yeah, exactly.
And enter you into a lottery.
I was just like, you're a dumb little donkey, aren't you? You want this, don't you?
Here's a carrot. Here's a carrot for you.
Exactly.
Well, that's exactly what I was saying earlier, right? Like, if this malady was polio, you don't have to give people ice cream to get it.
Exactly.
Right?
100%.
Like
100%.
the incentives. I'm like, this isn't just about COVID. Like every single time, I'm skeptical and suspicious of things that are auxiliary to a product to sell that product, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It doesn't just matter. It's like, here, this vacuum, if you buy this vacuum, you can also, get $100 off your next purchase. I'm like, okay, what's wrong with the vacuum? It's basically boils down, if you have a quality product, whether it be physical or intellectual, you don't need auxiliary reasons for people to want it. There's something self-evident about it, right?
Right. And so then then they essentially took away optional sort of freedoms and an enjoyment from life and withheld that until people complied, right? And then they still needed another contingent of people, so they'd gotten that sort of majority amount where they by introducing the mandates for being fired if you didn't get vaccinated. They'd already taken care of the majority. So it was like, well, the majority's doing it. Why can't you? You know what I mean? And then they weren't actually like,
don't you want to be a team player?
Exactly. And so then they were able to represent this like majority status on the side with the government. And it's like, well, everybody's doing it but you. What's wrong with you? Why don't you be a better citizen? You know? And
now we're going to take your livelihood away.
Exactly. We're going to take away everything if you don't comply. Bend the knee now.
Yeah. So bend the knee now, obey.
Exactly.
And I think what's interesting about all of this is I actually really think that this will be a very interesting part of the conversation. There's those of us on this that have decided not to, and those that and Luke or whatever, like the medical status doesn't matter. But what matters is I want to talk about, Dan and I have been talking about this a lot, and Zach, making the decision to stand up despite the government saying we will take everything from you. What did that do for you, Zach, Dan? And then I'd be interested in, Luke, and why you made the decision you did. If you want to share that, if you don't, that's totally fine as well.
Sorry. For me, what did it do for me? It was weird. It was very, very weird. You know, I like to make the joke, you know, I grew up on punk rock bands. So like sticking it to the man was like just a way of life, right? But like I would do it in my teens with my skateboard and like not being home on time for curfew. Like this was a whole different situation and scenario. And what I learned through it is that the best way to live your life is to not let anyone tell you what to do and to make decisions for yourself. And obviously people who didn't get vaccinated came under a lot of pressure for making that decision. And I'm thankful for some of that pressure because it taught me that my brain has value too. And the way I see things has value too. And the decisions that I can make for me, regardless of what other people think. And it gives you a sense of independence. And cultivating that, I feel in my own life has value.
Pressure makes diamonds, baby.
Yeah, coal to diamonds.
Yeah, I know for sure it made me a stronger person. I mean, like it was hell going through it because it was like there was little. I was like doing sales right for my company too, and like there's people that I would meet that would like tell me that like I belonged in like a concentration camp and would like kick me off their property, like not even to like walk around the exterior to like put a quote together for it. It wasn't the fact that they were worried about me having COVID. It was you disgust me as a person, get off my property type of situation.
Well, and the dating situation, if you want to share,
and yeah, like there's so many women that I talked to over the since the vaccine rollout and stuff like that like would just like they're like great conversation, oh you're a great guy, whatever, and it's like you're not vaccinated, you're the scum of the earth, you're evil.
Yeah, it was like a complete 180 every time.
On a dime.
Like they loved talking to you, they loved your perspective on things, they thought you were an amazing person. And that to me was when I knew this was a religion. Because for those who don't know, I was living with Dan during during what I would argue kind of the darkest period of COVID, which was when we all kind of began to realize that this wasn't going away and that this was being used by governments to control the citizenry and force them to make decisions they didn't want to.
And I think you and I both have a very strong constitution as well. And like, we were able to like stand up to that and be like, never, and it wasn't about the vaccine really at the end of the day. It was about, you can't tell me that you can't compel behavior. You know, you can restrict behavior. That's acceptable, but like, you cannot compel me to,
I will not kneel. I will not kneel.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's like my way, right? It's like,
yeah, exactly.
We did what we had to do and saw it through without exemption.
Without exemption, exactly.
And I mean, it was pretty like, I mean, it was a sense of existential terror, almost just feeling the walls closing in on you. And if we were at that place with the internal makeup that we have, I totally understand why the vast majority of people weren't able to withstand the pressure or just like chose to get vaccinated for whatever reason. You know, there's a multitude of, there's pretty much as many reasons people got vaccinated as there are people, right? But I mean, like to withstand that pressure that the Canadian government was putting on its citizenry, and not, you know, if it was like a stance on freedom and respect, you know, that's different than you know, personal fear of the disease. But if it was a stance on, you know, personal freedom, I totally understand why people cracked under the pressure, you know, because it was not easy.
No. Now, Luke, I think you probably have a different perspective. So I think, you know, we need to add that, so it's not just us all being like, yeah, we rock.
I think in a lot of the ways you guys are talking about it, my perspective is the same. This could be a bit of revisionist history, but I don't remember exactly. But I think I got my first dose of the vaccination before it was really talked about mandates coming in. So I think I chose to get it. I don't recall being like, oh, I got to do this because I got to be able to go to the bar still, kind of thing.
Right.
My memory recollects it as a kind of like imperfect calculated risk, right? Like long-term COVID versus, or like what COVID might do to my body versus what the vaccine might do to my body. And as it appeared, the virality of COVID was getting worse, and it was just more likely that if I hadn't had it before, I definitely was going to get it. It's like, it's more kind of like operating in an imperfect world with imperfect information and making a calculated risk, I would say, you know? I, again, wish that rather than saying the vaccine was safe, they said things like the vaccine is mostly safe and here are the potential side effects, right? Like totally informed consent, because the truth is there's no medical procedure that's safe, right? Right. It's just, again, like Thomas Sowell says, there's no solutions, there's only trade-offs. That's also true in the medical world, right? Like there are surgeries that you could get where something could go wrong. Maybe the surgeon makes a mistake, cuts the wrong artery on accident, just a tremor in the hand, right? And you could die from that. And in the post analysis, it was still the right idea to get the surgery, right? Like it's just mutations and randomness happen. And so I was at the data at the time, and I wasn't following it nearly as much as I was at the beginning, but it was like, it did seem like hospitalizations for COVID were happening more. Again, they were just reporting that it was more unvaccinated than vaccinated. And I guess I kind of also thought like, well, if I get COVID, I'd rather not go to the hospital, even if it's not likely that I would if I get it. It's still kind of worth that risk, right? That kind of thing. But from the very beginning, the medical issue, I think, is different. And I think that is the right of people to make their own decision. And I might point out, maybe this is a disagreement. I don't know. I was thinking about this a little bit. I don't like the term very much, getting the jab, because it has a same pejorative flavor to me as what people say anti-vax, like, oh, you're anti-vax versus, oh, you got the jab. In one sense, it's literally nonsensical because there's lots of other forms that are inoculations that come through injections that everyone who says you got the jab gets. So at that level, so the jab being the COVID vaccine, fair enough. But I think it's a kind of lazy and non-starting way to figure out how to get back to that equal citizenry. You know, as to channel the spirit of Abraham Lincoln when he said, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master." As I would not be anti-vax, so I would not get the jab, or say get the jab, that kind of thing.
Right.
Just because it's all the psychological intent behind it that I kind of care about.
Either borrower or lender be.
This is something that I've noticed quite extensively, which is it has become utterly tribal. Now, is there reasons for the tribal nature of what's happened? Absolutely. Have I picked my tribe? 100%. But the question is, should that tribe then become antagonistic towards other tribes? And honestly, there's a lot of people within the unvaccinated community who are there's rumors going around that if you have sex with a vaccinated person, you will then have the vaccine. This is not just a rumor. There's a lot of people who believe this, right?
Fight not long with monsters. Fight not long with monsters.
Now, I think that now I have a little bit of a different perspective on that. And that I think one group of Canadians has been deeply traumatized to the point of leaving this country, like our dear cousin Dan, who I suspect will probably never come back at this point because of what happened. He cannot live in a place where that's allowed to happen, right? And actually,
it got to a point where I was like, even if COVID goes away tomorrow, I'm not going to be able to respect my neighbors.
Yeah.
Who screw, it does. You know what I mean?
I have to say, it sounds like all three of you were swimming in much more ugly waters than I have been.
Well, we weren't vaccinated.
We weren't vaccinated.
But I just haven't heard any stories of that in my local life of unvaccinated people here getting that kind of vitriol.
Right.
So
that's fascinating.
Fair enough.
That's fascinating because
let's be honest, BC and to an extent Alberta are much more freedom-loving places. BC was settled by draft dodgers, like that, hippies. Like Nelson is hippie
true.
Central, right?
Yeah,
like,
that's actually a good one.
Let's be honest. Like
True.
you're not exactly, but like southwestern Ontario is full of like the automatons. Right?
I'll tell you what. If there's anything this podcast has taught me, it's that Ontario is not that great.
No.
Okay.
I wish it was, but it wasn't.
You know, the culture war has made it that like the so-called anti-vax, which again is such a stupid term because it's so lazy. It's so intellectually lazy to say that. But the so-called anti-vax of COVID are, you know, right-wingers. Well, not in Nelson. They're all hippies and like free-spirited.
Right.
So it's like there's been a funny marriage here between people who don't want to get vaccinated of like truckers and people who haven't worked in 20 years, you know?
I think there's a huge seismic political shift going on in all of Western civilization between the pro-government and the anti-government forces. And I think we're going to see a big alignment of like the church going uptight conservative type and the hippies are going to be on the same side for the next generation because of the government overreach that we're seeing happening.
Yeah, and I think a big reason why, you know, the three of us may have swam in muddier waters than you did, Luke, is that, like, you know, as unvaccinated, as a vaccinated person, you maybe didn't feel the walls sort of closing in on you as, you know, things got tighter and tighter, and it's like, you know, we started out, you know, calling the people who just, you know, hadn't gotten around to getting vaxxed the vaccine hesitant. You know?
Right.
And then over time, it's like, well, we've gotten the majority now, so the rest of you are the anti-vaxxers, and you wouldn't want to associate yourself with an anti-vaxxer, would you? You wouldn't want an anti-vaxxer at your wedding or your birthday party or just to your home in general, would you? And they did such frankly, a brilliant PR job of just like ratcheting up the pressure. You know what I mean? Otherizing the unvaccinated for, you know, what historically has been most personal choice. Yeah, total scapegoating.
I'm not going to say who, but I was in a foreign country during the height of the Delta wave, before vaccine mandates made it impossible for me to fly. And he looked, and I was telling people I wasn't going to get vaccinated, and tons of people would look at me and say, David, you are putting the Star of David on yourself. They said that to me. Right? You are making yourself a scapegoat. Wow. You're allowing yourself to be made a scapegoat. And it was hard. It was hard. Political circles, I'm pretty much the only major political organizer that I'm aware of. There's one other. I won't mention him because it's not my job to do that. One other unvaccinated in my entire profession that I'm aware of in this country. Like, that's wild.
Yeah.
So
like at my level, sorry, like someone I would consider a colleague, right?
Right. And there was that going on in the last election too. Like the liberals were like, the conservatives are all anti-vax because they aren't requiring their MPs to disclose. You know?
Yeah, like disclose their own personal medical decisions. When is this? And a lot of this is like, I have to kind of disagree a little bit with what you said earlier, Dan, about this being unprecedented, because look at the Inquisition, where they just hunted down opponents of the Catholic Church and killed them for their beliefs, right? Literally tortured and killed them. I think this is a very
in modern civilized society.
Yeah, in modern, exactly.
Okay,
so Luke, you have a thought on this? Okay, go, Luke.
I might caution ratcheting up rhetoric simply because I think that you have a lot more allies than you think you do, maybe, than what media says. So I happen to fall into what I think is the majority of adult Canadians, which is vaccinated and against the vaccine mandates. And by that, I mean, I think at least 51% of Canadian adults are probably vaccinated and philosophically against vaccine mandates. And what we hear are not that, right? That's not the news and social media and the uptight customers you had, Dan. Right. Those are the people who feel it's like they're self-appointed in a way to make noise about it. And they have a platform too. But I just think that I don't know any person in my life who's vaccinated who has in any way espoused any desire to punish the unvaccinated. It's just been the few with the power and the media. So right. I guess my hopeful hand across the aisle, so to speak, in this is that I would hope people who feel traumatized or certainly and legitimately aggrieved by the mandates realize that they have a lot more allies in the citizenry than they might otherwise guess, given the mandates themselves and the loud people who've traumatized them.
Yeah, actually, I totally agree with that. And,
sorry. Go ahead.
I think we'd be remiss to not wrap up with a little bit of the convoy situation too, which is like, I think that like for me, I went down to Ottawa and like I was there for a couple of days, slept in my truck in minus 20-degree weather. And for me, that was such an eye-opening experience because I got that experience that you were talking about, Luke, where like, I was able to see that like, oh my God, like there are other people who feel the same way, you know what I mean? And like, it was like the way that the media spun that whole situation about like being filled with neo-Nazis and Confederate flags and, you know, one drunk guy like peed on in a place he shouldn't have, you know, like that's the first time that's ever happened, you know? But you know, seeing just like the jubilation among everybody that I came into contact with, and it was like, we're people in particular that hadn't had any social interaction for the most part for 2 years, you know? And I think if you want to ascribe a cynical view to it, they did a great job of, you know, isolating people where you couldn't communicate with the people who were like, you know, had sensible stances like you're talking about, Luke, you know what I mean? It's like you only heard from the media and the government was using people like yourself as a cudgel to be like, well, listen, you know, like Luke Mason got vaccinated. What's wrong with you? You know, it's like he's part of the majority and you're the small fringe minority.
With unacceptable views.
With unacceptable views.
Yeah, I think Luke really nailed it on the head with the point he just made, but also by saying like, hey, like I didn't realize like the amount of murky water you were in. And I think both sides of the aisle are guilty of that. I think the actual minority in the country exist on both sides, and they are the loud ones who are screaming,
right,
if you made that decision to get it, you're a terrible person. How could you do that? And then obviously the reverse of that is, you know, the people who scream anti-vaxxer. And I think both of those people are ridiculous. And the majority of Canadians are like Luke, like myself, like Dan, like David, who don't really care what choice you made, but just want to live in a civilized society next to the people in their country, including the crazies who are screaming loud. They have a place too. Because I believe in free speech, because I believe in a free country, they have a place too. I'll probably not really want to be your friend, but you have a place to exist in this country. And it's about decentralization and getting back to the citizen, because the citizen is capable of working that out every time. I truly believe that. I think as Canadians, we're able to take responsibility for our own lives and for our own decisions and live in respect and harmony with the people who open the door next to us. And that's the country I want to live in.
So,
Zach, we got to get that one clipped for TikTok. That was brilliant.
Very good. Very good.
Okay, so to me, the Freedom Convoy is such a great example. It's democracy in a microcosm, okay? And I think we've gone sleepy on democracy because of how much it's created wealth and ease in our lives. Like, we're all millennials. We all grew up in arguably the greatest decade ever to be a kid, which was the 90s. And then arguably the greatest decade ever to be a teenager, which was the 2000s. Like, there was basically no problems in a global
and the music was so
sense. Good. Exactly. So,
although every generation does have its burdens too. You know, if we were adults entering into adulthood at the .com crash, you know, we might think that was a significant to overcome 9/11, right?
So democracy actually is hard work and messy, and it's not the norm, and it's not every generation needs to defend it. And that's one of the coolest things I've learned about being in my 30s, and COVID has really rammed that home, is that the things that have made my life great at a social and structural level are not given and are actually quite rare and actually demand my attention and ability. Yeah. And so the convoy to me is a great example of that, because I am like totally pro citizens of a country protesting their government, because I have read even one book of history which shows that the government can do way more damage to the people than the people can do to the government, right? Like that's just the norm of abuse. And so I can understand and agree with the being against vaccine mandates and protesting that. That's totally cool. And I would support that. And at the same time, you know, because I can walk and chew gum, I could go to a protest like that, come up to one of those people with those F Trudeau flags and probably find them untakeable and uninteresting. And I'm not really going to talk to them. And I don't feel like associating with them in my private life, right? Like I can do both of those things. I don't have to romanticize the truckers to agree with their general principle. I can enjoy certain ones. I can think some of them are smarter than the others. And it matters what the leadership of the truckers say, not some person part of it. And that like kind of elementary distinction between, it mattered a lot more what Martin Luther King said about the civil rights movement than some low level bigot in it. There were very pro Black supremacist people who were around that civil rights movement. Doesn't matter. It wasn't what was represented in that movement. And the same with the convoy. The moment the convoy gets its demands and it stays and it wants other things that are like unconstitutional, or like we're not leaving till Trudeau's out of office. Well, that I'm not on board for that, because that's what we have elections for, right? I don't need to romanticize the populace to be on their side. What was that line from Gladiator, David? I might not be a man of the people, but I try to be a man for the people.
Yes,
yes.
And
to me, that's like coming back to understanding what democracy is defending rights of people that you would never want to spend private time with. And that's totally fine.
And frankly, there were people at the convoy that I was like, you know, I was there kind of in solidarity with them. We had that united, you know, bond or whatever, that I was like, I don't really care for this person, you know, they're not my.
This is what's important. If they're breaking a law, arrest them for that law. Don't do an emergencies act. Right? Like the whole point of civilization is that we already have laws on the book. So if they're loitering or whatever, there's got to be some law that they're breaking. Arrest them for that. And then if you don't like the law, pass it through the legislation, because that's also democracy.
Well, and the problem with it all is that the protesters, and this is why the police chief had to resign as well, is that the protesters and the police had a phenomenal relationship. Everybody there was respectful, thanking the police for being there to keep everything safe, wishing them well and safety, and shaking hands, you know what I mean? Completely, you know, on board with them, no problems whatsoever. So they're like, well, we're not going to go like, you know, running in here bashing people with clubs, you know what I mean? They knew them. They had a good relationship with them, and then so they had to you know, compile a, you know, list of officers from around the country who are willing to take bonus pay to go in and, you know, basically, you know, be hired SS guards essentially, you know. and like I was actually traveling down to Texas, like looking for like a job and like places to stay and stuff like that, when like I was there for the first part of the convoy, and then I was in the States when it was sort of ramping up to its peak. I crossed the what is it, from the Detroit to Windsor, the is it the Peace Bridge? Yeah.
No, that's Erie. It's the Ambassador Bridge, I believe.
Ambassador Bridge, thank you. We actually crossed that very bridge like 2 days before it got shut down for like a week. And then you know, so I was in the States just like watching all this from afar, watching the government freeze bank accounts of people who dissented against them. And, you know, it was like stories of like people who just like donated because they supported the cause, who were just like, you know, family folk, you know,
or single mothers.
Yeah. And then like freezing bank accounts. And then once they finally like enacted these, in my opinion, like I guess technically legal, which is the sad part about Canada to me, measures of like the Emergencies Act without authorization from even Parliament, where they have this week-long period to just be ruthless savages unchecked. And then they're like, they're towing vehicles and then like intentionally leaving people's windows down with like technology in the front seats and like allowing the cabs to be covered in snow and stuff. And it's just like, it's a big fuck you from the government. It's like, you will not shame us. We have the power, and you're not.
Because Justin Trudeau is a man child who gets offended by people not agreeing with him.
Yes,
and he's a petty tyrant.
Yeah. But here's what I would say: even if Justin Trudeau was like the most dignified, soft-spoken, thoughtful leader, it doesn't matter, right? His actual personality is irrelevant. That's not what you should do, right? He should. The system of the democracy is more important than any given leader in it. And if he's not fit for purpose based on his policies and decision making, like that's the fact that he maybe is a man child and filled with hubris might get more partisan shots at him, but might not coalesce a wider base in voting for an opposition party, let's say, which, in my opinion, is probably what the opposition party should be shooting for right
now. Fair enough. We've gone over our time, so we're going to let it go for this. But this has been one of my favorites so far. I love all three of you immensely. And I'll let Zach close us off. But I just want to thank you both for coming and joining Zach and I.
Yeah,
it was a fun conversation.
Yeah,
thanks.
This is a blast. Thanks
to Luke and Dan for joining us. Thank you to the listeners for listening to our little family reunion. I hope that we can all exit this conversation and just go out into the world and be nice to people and accept people for what they believe. And even if you disagree with them, it's actually really easy to disagree with someone and coexist, especially in a public society. Like it's a little harder maybe when it's in a home or that sort of thing. And if it is in a home, that's still something that you should work to do. But for goodness sake, in public society, like just be nice to the person next to you at the grocery store. It's really easy. It's so easy. We live in a beautiful country full of incredible citizens with diverse ideas and opinions. And that's how it should be. And let's all live.
Everyone can be decent.
Yes.
Everyone can be decent.
If all men count with you,
but none too much.
And with that, we'll close it. So thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's The CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great our country is.